Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight.
Let the mystery begin.
The rain had begun not long after dusk, one of those steady, ceaseless downpours that seems to hush the world into secrecy. In the small village of St. Mary Mead, every window glowed softly against the storm, yellow lamplight shimmering through curtains like half-guarded confidences. The air smelt of wet earth, chimney smoke, and the faint, lingering sweetness of tea leaves at the vicarage. The drawing room was prepared for what was meant to be a most ordinary Thursday tea, a civilized affair, as Mrs. Clement had put it, with lace tablecloths, scones, and polite conversation. The clock on the mantel ticked its slow, dutiful rhythm, indifferent to the gathering tension that would, before the hour was out, turn an innocent afternoon into whispered scandal. Reverend Leonard Clement sat by the fire, his spectacles low on his nose, rereading a sermon that he privately doubted anyone would remember come Sunday. His wife, Griselda, floated about the room with her usual mixture of impatience and charm. There was no one quite like Griselda, beautiful, impulsive, and forever exasperated by the dull decencies of parish life. Really,
Leonard, she sighed, rearranging the flowers for the third time.
Must we always have Colonel Protheroe for tea? He bores me to extinction, the vicar smiled mildly, used to his wife's dramatics. He is our churchwarden, my dear, and it's rather difficult to refuse him when he insists upon dropping by. Besides, he added, glancing at the clock, Miss Marple is coming as well.
I expect she'll find him rather less dull. Griselda gave a light laugh.
Miss Marple?
Oh, she'll find him guilty of something before the biscuits are cold. Outside, the rain beat harder against the windows.
Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the fields like a warning too late to be heeded. By 4 o'clock, the guests had arrived. Colonel Protheroe, punctual and pompous, smelling faintly of tobacco and military polish. Mrs. Price Ridley wrapped in disapproval, and finally Miss Marple, neat as a pin, her gentle eyes missing nothing. She took her usual seat near the hearth, folded her gloves with precision, and observed the others with that unassuming attentiveness that made her the terror of every gossip in St. Mary Mead. It began simply enough. Polite talk of church matters, the new curate's stammer.
The weather.
But beneath it all, something subtle shifted, a tone, a pause, a glance too quickly withdrawn. Miss Marple's delicate fingers rested on her teacup as though testing its temperature, her mind quietly arranging impressions the way a botanist might press petals between pages. Colonel Protheroe, meanwhile, seemed in particularly bad humour.
Damn nonsense, if you ask me, he barked suddenly, slamming his cup on the saucer.
The choir's been lazy, the accounts are muddled, and someone's pilfered the offertory box again. Mrs. Clement stiffened. Really, Colonel? But he went on, oblivious to the tightening silence. If the vicar won't take the matter in hand, I shall. The village is going to ruin. Mark my words, too much leniency breeds corruption. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly toward the vicar, whose patient smile masked what might have been irritation or guilt. Outside, lightning illuminated the window panes in stark white flashes. For a moment, all faces were silvered ghosts, frozen in tableau. Then came a sound that did not belong to tea nor thunder, a crash, the shattering of porcelain, and Griselda's startled cry. Colonel Protheroe had gone very still, his hand clutching his throat. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. The cup had fallen from his fingers, its contents spreading across the lace like spilled ink. "Leonard!" Griselda gasped.
"He's choking." Miss Marple rose swiftly, her expression grave.
She was already at the Colonel's side, bending close, her calm composure unbroken, even as she pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. Her gaze lifted to the vicar's. "I'm afraid," she said softly, "that Colonel Protheroe will not be needing another cup of tea." Silence descended, thick, absolute. Only the clock continued its implacable ticking, counting the seconds that had so suddenly turned to eternity. The scent of bergamot hung in the air. The rain hissed against the glass, and on the pale linen cloth, where a moment ago there had been laughter, now lay a single teacup, its rim faintly stained by something darker than tea. Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness, low and sure. "It would seem," she murmured, "that death has joined us for tea." She looked up, her grey eyes reflecting the tremor of candlelight. Chapter. For the first minute after Miss Marple spoke, no one breathed. The fire crackled, the rain whispered at the panes. The clock counted out the dreadful certainty with smug exactitude. Then Griselda moved only a step, and her silk skirt brushed the edge of the fallen cup so that it rolled like a pale moon against the skirting board, and came to rest with a faint porcelain sigh. "Dead?" she said, as if the word might fracture if spoken above a whisper. "Leonard, he can't be. Surely the doctor—" "The doctor, yes," Reverend Clement replied, his voice suddenly firm, authority springing up like a sheltering hedge.
"I shall telephone Dr. Haydock at once." He crossed to the writing table and lifted the receiver with a hand that did not tremble, though the colour had left his face.
"Griselda, keep Mrs. Price Ridley comfortable. Miss Marple, if you would." But Miss Marple had already drawn the Colonel's chair back from the rug as gently as if it were a crib. She set her palm lightly against the cooling hand that still clutched the armrest with stubborn indignation. Her gaze moved in small, precise arcs. First the cup and saucer, then the plate of scones, the lemon wedges beading with moisture, the tiny jug of milk standing demurely among its companions. Her nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. "Bergamot, yes."
"Assam, strong. And something else. No, perhaps memory, Jane, not chemistry."
The scent of the old rectory garden when the foxgloves trembled with bees. That summer when poor Mr. Linton mistook the laurel leaves. Ah, but best not to jump to laurel so quickly. Men die more easily than they are murdered. And yet, Mrs. Price Ridley's voice sliced the hush with frightful efficiency.
"I knew it," she announced, eyes glittering beneath her hat brim.
I felt an oppression, a true oppression, upon entering. There has been a moral laxity in the choir, indeed, in the entire parish, and now heaven has answered. "Do, for pity's sake, be quiet," Griselda said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. Her pretty mouth quivered, and she pressed a hand to her throat. "Miss Marple, can one simply die like that? He was perfectly well a moment ago. Colonel Protheroe was a robust man," Miss Marple said gently. "But robust men have fallen in church aisles and on cricket pitches before now. However," she looked again at the thin brown stain that ringed the teacup, "one does like to be thorough." The vicar turned from the telephone. "Dr. Haydock is on his way. He asked that we disturb nothing." He looked at the body of his churchwarden, mouth slack, moustache damp from the tea, eyes staring with an anger that had not had time to soften, and a grave sorrow settled upon his features. "We shall do as he says." They shifted a little, the living rearranging themselves about the dead, as furniture is nudged to make way for a piano. Griselda drew the curtains slightly together so that the rain's silver flicker softened to a sheen. She lit 2 more candles, and their tremulous light spilled warmth into the corners of the room. It felt indecently beautiful, that light, like a benediction laid upon a scene it could not alter. In the few minutes before the doctor arrived, the room became a pool of whispered inference. Mrs. Price Ridley volunteered that Colonel Protheroe had always consumed his tea too hot.
Everyone knew it was bad for the heart.
She then confided, though there was no confessional and no absolution, that the Colonel had quarrelled only last evening with the proprietor of the Blue Boar over some unpaid bill, and if he had been less high-handed he would be alive today. Griselda, whose temper and mercy often ran together in surprising ways, poured the woman a very small brandy and told her to sip, not talk. Miss Marple, quietly circumnavigating the tea table, examined the service with the domestic expertise of a general inspecting his front line. She noted that there were 5 cups set out, the 5th being her own, that the sugar tongs were slightly sticky, as if someone had set them down upon a spill, that a smear, faint as a moth's wing, marked the rim of the Colonel's cup. She also observed that the plate of lemon slices, 3 remaining, showed the impression of a thumbnail in one edge of the topmost. These she did not touch. One always regrets touching things later, like interfering in young people's romances or pruning a rosebush too eagerly. Dr. Haydock arrived with his typical briskness, bringing in gusts of rain and the odour of wet wool. He knelt to examine the Colonel while Miss Marple withdrew to the hearth. After a brief minute he rose and shook his head. "Gone," he said. "Some minutes now." His eyes moved to Miss Marple's, and a look passed between them that was neither gloomy nor sensational, but practical. "We shall call Inspector Slack. Not that I wish to waste his evening when there's nothing to be done." He paused, sniffed the air. "Tea? A Sam with Earl Grey leaves mixed through," Miss Marple supplied mildly. "Mrs. Clement's preference." She inclined her head toward the table. "The Colonel had lemon." Dr. Haydock's glance sharpened.
"And no one else?"
"I took milk," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Price Ridley, sugar and milk. Mr. Clement, milk. Griselda, no lemon, no milk. She rarely takes either. The Colonel was the only one who added lemon, and he served himself." She smiled apologetically at Griselda. "Forgive me for observing. It is a weakness of mine." "God bless your weaknesses," Haydock muttered. "We shall wait for Slack." The inspector came, as one dreaded and expected that he would, wrapped in a dark greatcoat and a manner that suggested a healthy scepticism about the capacity of vicars and spinsters to tell the truth. He was a thick-set man with a bulldog jaw, the kind that looked determined to be disappointed in people, and seldom was. He surveyed the room. He surveyed the Colonel. He surveyed the vicar, who looked back at him with a composure born of the pulpit and a conscience remarkably free of scandal. When he noticed Miss Marple, he gave a slight start, and then the resigned nod of a man who knows an ally when he sees one, even if he would rather not. "Well then," Inspector Slack said, pulling out a small notebook. "Which of you gave the Colonel his last cup of tea?" "No one gave it to him," Griselda said. "He took it himself. He always does." I put the tray out, everything scones, jam, cream, lemon, sugar. She bit her lip.
I didn't make up the cups individually. I never do for tea."
"Coffee, yes."
"Tea, no. And the pot?"
Slack lifted the lid, inhaled cautiously, and then set it down again. "Same brew for everyone?"
"Yes," the vicar said.
"I believe so. You believe so, sir?" Miss Marple's voice flowed in like balm. "I can assure you, Inspector, that the tea was poured from one pot for all our cups."
"I watched Mrs. Clement pour for me after the Colonel had served himself."
We could, of course, test the pot, the jug, the sugar basin, the lemon plate. But since we are establishing the scene, we are establishing facts, Miss Marple. Slack interrupted, though without rudeness. "Facts first, interpretations after." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, unoffended. "How sensible." Slack questioned them with a steady patience that would have done credit to any parish priest on a troublesome Saturday. The times were carefully noted, the guests' arrivals just before 4, the Colonel's complaint about the accounts at 10 past, the thunder at 13, the exclamation and the fall of the cup just before 20 past. It is surprising how much Arcadian minutiae crystallize around the moment a man dies. The vicar recalled the clock striking the quarter. Mrs. Price Ridley recollected that the rain increased then. Griselda was certain the maid, Gladys, had come in to ask about the coal scuttle. Miss Marple remembered a blackbird calling once from the dripping lilac between flashes of lightning. "Now we come to the matter of what the Colonel ate and drank," Slack said. "He had a scone?"
"Half a scone," Griselda replied.
"He spread too much jam, then complained of stickiness." "And lemon in his tea," Slack said.
"Only lemon."
"No milk?" Miss Marple's eyes rested upon the lemon plate.
A thumbnail mark and the pith bruised.
Lemon is a clean thing, sharp and honest. Poison likes to hide in clean things because one doesn't suspect them. There was that case at Little Furs, Emily Blunt and the barley sugar, but that was years ago, and the culprit was a girl too fond of tragic novels. "Did any of you notice a taste, a scent?" Dr. Haydock asked.
Almonds bitter?
"No," Griselda said. "It was ordinary tea."
Rather strong? Her face changed. Oh, Leonard, what if it was the lemon?
"What if something—" "Everything on that table will be tested," Slack said. "Doctor, you'll want the body moved to the surgery?" "For the moment it should remain," Haydock said. "If this is a sudden failure of the heart, I will know soon enough."
He stopped and his mouth flattened.
"We mustn't pronounce before we are sure." The inspector began to parcel the tea things as if they were small criminals trying to escape capture. Each cup was noted, each spoon wrapped, the pot, the milk, the sugar, the lemon dish. He sent the village constable to fetch a locked evidence box from the car. His questions continued, unobtrusive and thorough. "Colonel Protheroe had enemies?" he asked blandly. "And in St. Mary Mead, that is like asking whether the parish fete has sponge cake." A string of names drifted forth. The Blue Boar's proprietor, Mrs. Lestrange, who had, so it was murmured, refused to sell her cottage when the colonel wanted the land. Young Dennis, the curate, whom the colonel scolded for his stammer in front of the choir. Dr. Stone, the archaeologist who had taken up residence at Old Hall, and whose digging, the colonel declared, would stir up pagan nonsense and vermin alike. And there were others, less defined, people whose accounts had been questioned, people whose children had been chastised, people whose geese had strayed and been reprieved only with fines and threats. Miss Marple listened with sorrow and a yearning precision. It is not the number of enemies that matters, but the intimacy of the grievance. A woman will bear a public insult and forgive it. A private humiliation eats at her like rust beneath paint. At the mention of Mrs. Lestrange, Griselda's gaze flickered. "She is not an enemy," she said too quickly.
"Merely private."
The colonel did not like privacy in others. He considered it a personal affront. "Where was Mrs. Lestrange this afternoon?" Slack asked. "How on earth should I know?" Griselda replied, colouring. "But if you will turn St. Mary Mead upside down at tea time, you will find everyone where they always are, except the one person you truly want." "Quite so, madam," Slack said. "And sometimes one finds the person one truly wants sitting in a vicarage drawing-room." A chill pricked the vicar's skin.
"You cannot believe I believe everything and nothing, sir, until I have reason."
"For example, I note the colonel arrived in a temper and made himself unpleasant."
"I note that you, Mr. Clement, have been at odds with him over parish accounts." "The accounts are not muddled," the vicar said quietly.
"They are undergoing a change of ledger format. It is tedious but accurate. And I note too," Slack went on equably, "that your wife, Mrs. Clement, is not overly fond of the late colonel." "I should be a curiosity if I were," Griselda said coolly. "But I do not poison people who bore me, Inspector. I merely assign them to the second tier of the guest list." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. She adored Griselda, could not help it, and yet she made a mental note all the same. One must be fair-minded even about those whom one likes. Pretty women are treated as if they could only sin in the direction of romance. They are perfectly able to sin in practical ways as well, though they seldom choose to. It stains the frock more than a kiss ever does. There was a soft rap at the door. Gladys, the maid, stood there with a face like wrung linen. "Please, ma'am," she whispered to Griselda. "Mrs. Archer from the cottage across the lane says there's a man asking where the vicar is. He was meant to see the colonel here this afternoon about the field boundaries, but he's gone off, he says, because of the storm."
And Miss Hartnell was at the gate with her bicycle, and she says, "Take a breath."
"Gladys," Miss Marple advised. The girl breathed, hiccuped, and blurted, "She says she saw the colonel in the lane not half an hour ago, quarrelling with someone." Inspector Slack turned.
Interest keen as a pointer's. With whom?
She didn't see. It was raining very hard. Gladys's eyes slid to the Colonel and away as if his disapproval might still strike her. Miss Hartnell said the voices were raised and it sounded like scandal, begging pardon. Miss Hartnell will oblige us with the particulars, Slack said. Doctor, with your leave, I will have the body removed shortly. We shall proceed with a post-mortem. While arrangements were made, men going in and out with respectful steps, a stretcher placed discreetly, a blanket lifted and laid, Miss Marple stood beside the mantel and watched the candle flames bow and recover in the draughts. She thought of young people's whispers, of old resentments hoarded like dried lavender, of lemon slices neatly set out upon a plate and a thumbnail pressed, quite innocently into the flesh when the Colonel's body had been removed and the drawing-room restored. To its polite symmetry, though nothing was altogether symmetrical any longer, the inspector concluded with a few brisk instructions. No one was to discuss the scene beyond necessities. No one was to leave the village without informing him. He would return in the morning. He looked, at last, at Miss Marple. Mrs. Rutherford's henhouse business, he said abruptly, as if resuming a conversation begun long ago. You told me at the time it was the boy, and you were right.
If you observe anything in this matter, well, perhaps you'll send word. He added with clumsy reluctance, if the word is nonsense, keep it. The word will be as plain as a loaf, Miss Marple said serenely.
I shall tell you if I know it. When he had gone, silence folded itself about the vicarage like a shawl. Griselda sank upon the sofa and covered her face with her hands. The vicar stood a moment, then went to her and touched her shoulder. My dear, he said softly, courage. She looked up at him with eyes that were not often tearful.
It's beastly, she said.
Beastly to have death here, like grease on one's best pan.
Oh, Leonard, forgive me. I am not good at dignities when I am frightened. You are very good, he said, with a tenderness that made Miss Marple look away.
And courage isn't dignified.
It simply persists. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had remained marooned in her chair like a moral monument, rose with a creak. I should go home, she announced, and warn my housekeeper against lemons. I never cared for them.
They have a foreign look. Let me fetch your umbrella, the vicar said, because he was habitually kind, even when it was misapplied. He left the room. Griselda turned to Miss Marple, and for a moment the younger woman's poise cracked to reveal the girl beneath.
Jane, she whispered, tell me truly, do you think there was foul play?
Miss Marple considered. I think, she said, that the Colonel's death was very sudden and very convenient to someone. But sudden deaths are often convenient to someone. The world is full of beneficiaries.
I should like very much to see the lemon plate again. She smiled, apologetic. I would never touch it, you know, only look. Gladys,
Griselda called, and when the girl came, she said, Bring the tea tray in here a moment, will you? Gladys hesitated. Begging pardon, ma'am, but the inspector— We shall not disturb anything, Miss Marple said. We shall observe. The tray arrived, and Miss Marple bent over it as if over a cradle. Her eyes, those shrewd, soft eyes, took in the jag of the lemon wedge where the thumbnail had pressed, the tiny dark mote clinging to the pith, the smear on the Colonel's cup that could have been from moustache wax, or something more sinister. She looked, too, at the sugar basin, inside a single grain clumped against the porcelain as if damp had touched it and left it alone again. The milk jug wore a thin tide mark, ordinary as yesterday's milk. The spoon that had served the lemon slices lay on the plate, and on its handle was an almost invisible hair, fair, very fine, quite possibly human. Gloves? Miss Marple murmured. No, village folk do not wear gloves in their own drawing-rooms. Mrs. Clement, do forgive me for being inquisitive, but was anyone in the kitchen shortly before tea besides yourself and Gladys? Griselda knitted her brows.
No, oh!
She started. Yes, Mr. Dennis, the curate, brought in a package for Leonard. He said the post was late and he had met the boy on the lane. He left it on the sideboard and apologized for dripping on the tile, then fled. Did he go near the tea things?
I don't think so.
The tray was near the stove.
I had not poured the tea yet. I set the lemons out after he left.
Jane, you can't suppose Dennis wouldn't harm a soul. Most souls wouldn't, Miss Marple said mildly. But souls do harm now and again when they are frightened or desperate or merely foolish.
I make no supposition at all.
I gather odds and ends as a thrifty housewife does. One never knows what will make a soup. The vicar returned to escort Mrs. Price Ridley into the rain. When he and Griselda were alone with Miss Marple once more, the house looked suddenly strange to them, as if an unfamiliar hand had shifted the pictures while they were not looking. The smell of tea had turned from homely to treacherous. The ticking clock no longer soothed but accused. Miss Marple, the vicar said at last, if this is poison, what then? I cannot bear the idea that a murderer sat at our table. Dear Mr. Clement, Miss Marple said, murderers have sat at very good tables and in the best pews and sung hymns lustily. But let us not run ahead. We must see what the doctor finds. If it is poison, lemon and poison are old acquaintances, then the question becomes a simple village riddle. Who had the opportunity to place the poison where the colonel might take it and others might not?
Lemon lies open and innocent.
Sugar too. Milk, less so, but you poured it and we can trust the jug. The pot served us all. The plate... She looked once more at the lemon wedges, their yellow gleam honeyed by candlelight. Lemon is the key that opens this lock, or it is a trick to send us down the garden path. There came then a faint knock, and without waiting for answer, the door edged open. A young man hovered, damp hair, clerical collar askew,
eyes bright as a startled fawn's. Dennis, the curate.
Looking less like a shepherd than one of the flock. I heard, he said, in that breathless rush that pushed his stammer to the edge of breaking. I heard, oh, Mr. Clement, Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple, Colonel Protheroe, is it true? It is, the vicar said gently. Come in, Dennis. There is nothing you can do now. Dennis stepped in, hands twisting.
Colonel Protheroe was... He was to see me tomorrow about the choir boy, Tommy. He swallowed.
I suppose it doesn't matter now. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, her tone light as a knitting needle. These little matters always matter very much indeed. Did you see the Colonel this afternoon, Mr. Dennis?
No, I mean only at a distance. I came by to leave the parcel, the prayer books from the binder, and I hurried away.
I was late for Mrs. Bantry's reading circle. Then the rain, it came down across the green like a sheet. I took shelter beneath Hartnell's hedge.
I thought I saw the Colonel in the lane.
He was speaking to someone, quarrelling perhaps, but I could not see the other person. The hedge is thick. Voices? The vicar prompted, raised.
His was unmistakable.
The other, low, quick.
A woman? He flushed, ashamed to have observed so much.
I ought not to gossip. It is not gossip when a man lies dead, Miss Marple said, with the grave kindness of a godmother.
Did you recognize the woman's voice?
He shook his head, only that she was not young. Not young, Miss Marple repeated. Not young excludes a drama of elopement and narrows one's lace drawer considerably. When the curate had gone, Griselda said, well then, it was Mrs. Price Ridley. She quarrels as easily as she prays. Miss Marple shook her head. Mrs. Price Ridley quarrels publicly. The voice he describes would rather choke than be overheard. There is an art to low and quick. It belongs to women with practice, in secrets, not in scandal. The clock chimed the half-hour after 6. In the hush that followed, the house seemed to contract about them, intimate and uneasy. The vicar turned up the fire. A flurry of sparks rose, brief and brave. We shall be questioned again tomorrow, he said. Inspector Slack will turn out every cupboard. And quite right, Miss Marple approved. Cupboards conceal the best things and the worst. She took up her gloves. I shall go now, my dears, and leave you to manage the evening. Lock the back door. Keep Gladys with you. And if anyone calls, anyone anxious for news, or, as they say, much simply checking, note the fact and the time. It is most instructive to see who comes to pay respects before the obituary is printed. Griselda walked her to the hall.
"Jane," she said, catching her friend's hand.
"I am so glad you were here." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "So am I, though it seems a dreadful thing to say. But one is glad to be useful, like a clean handkerchief at a funeral." She squeezed Griselda's fingers. "Do not borrow trouble from tomorrow. It will arrive fully furnished. Tonight, make tea again, fresh tea, and try to eat a scone, and think of ordinary matters, such as whether the hydrangeas will need staking in this rain."
Ordinary thoughts are little boats that keep us afloat on sudden floods. She stepped out into the damp twilight, lifting her umbrella to meet the shimmer of rain.
The lane shone like pewter, the hedges beaded with diamond drops. As she went, she looked once at the lilac where the blackbird had called, and once at the vicarage window where a candle still trembled. She felt the old, familiar stirring, half sorrow, half purpose, that came when human folly had tangled itself into a knot, and some patient fingers must begin to tease it free. Lemon! A quarrel in the lane, a hair upon a spoon, a stain upon a cup, a thumbnail mark upon the wedge. She smiled to herself, a small, inward smile that no one saw. "We shall see, Jane, and we shall unpick it as quietly as one darns a stocking with small, neat, invisible stitches until the whole will hold again." Behind her, the vicarage door closed. Ahead, the village lay in a soft, wetted darkness. Somewhere, a bicycle bell chimed and faded. Somewhere, a dog barked as if at a ghost. Miss Marple went home to her tidy parlour, and her tray laid by the hearth, where she would not drink lemon this evening, but a simple tisane of mint, while her mind arranged cups and wedges and voices in the lane into a pattern that might, with care, become a picture. And in the vicarage drawing-room, where candles still made islands of light upon the table, the lemon slices sat like bright, unrepentant crescents, little moons that had watched a man rise in anger and fall in silence. Chapter 2, Morning, came reluctantly to St. Mary Mead. The rain had washed the village into a pale watercolour, gardens drenched, lanes slick and gleaming, chimneys exhaling the weary sighs of damp wood. Inside her ivy-clad cottage on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, the Times neatly folded beside her plate, a small vase of late roses giving a genteel air of denial to the memory of last night's horror. The tea in her cup was hot, pure and untainted by lemon poison, she thought, knitting her brows as she buttered her toast with calm precision. If poison it be, then it was not opportunity alone. It was nerve, calculation, and a little knowledge. Not so easy as people think to kill a man with tea. A soft tap came at her window. She turned to see her nephew Raymond West, writer, aesthete, an occasional sufferer of artistic ennui, peering in with a sheepish grin. "My dear Aunt Jane," he said as she opened the door, "you're already a headline."
"The Vicarage tea tragedy!"
"It's in the morning paper, though heaven knows how Fleet Street got wind of it so soon." "Fleet Street always travels faster than decency," Miss Marple replied serenely. "Do come in, Raymond."
"You'll find the eggs quite perfect," he obeyed, shivering slightly as the mist clung to his coat.
"They're saying it was heart failure."
"But you saw it happen."
"Was it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "One never likes to speak before the doctor confirms, dear, but I should think not. I have seen men die naturally, and they do not usually seize at the throat unless something very unnatural is assisting them." Raymond blinked. "You mean poison?" "I mean only that life is fragile," she said, "and that in St. Mary Mead one should never underestimate what can be accomplished over tea." By 10 o'clock, the vicarage was again the centre of gravity for the entire parish. A constable stood guard at the gate, looking embarrassed, but resolute. Inside, Inspector Slack conducted his inquiries with brisk competence and a growing frown. Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary examination. Death by poisoning.
Almost certainly from cyanide. Cyanide? Slack repeated grimly, pacing the vicar's study.
Fast, bitter, and unmistakable.
Doctor says it was taken with the tea.
So, where was the poison introduced?
Not in the pot. Everyone drank from it. Not in the sugar. Same reason.
Not in the milk. That leaves the lemon, Griselda paled. But the lemons came from the shop yesterday, Mr. Smithers's. I sliced them myself just before tea. You sliced all three at once?
Yes, and set them on the plate?
Yes, the Colonel took his piece with the tongs, I think. Then either one slice was already poisoned when you cut it, or someone tampered afterward, Slack said. And unless the shopkeeper's a lunatic, I'd bet on the latter. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in the corner, looked up. One slice poisoned among several, ingenious. It ensures only one victim. Rather like hiding one bad apple among a dozen. Slack eyed her warily. You've had experience of this, Miss Marple? Oh, no, she said, her needles clicking. Only of apples. The inspector summoned each person who had been present. Griselda first, still pale but defiant. Then the vicar, calm and weary. Then Mrs. Price Ridley, who managed to turn her statement into a sermon. And finally, young Gladys, who sniffled throughout. It emerged that the tea things had been left unattended for precisely 3 minutes, while Griselda went upstairs to fetch a cushion for Mrs. Price Ridley's back. Gladys had answered the front bell. Dennis, the curate, bringing the parcel, and Miss Marple, alone in the drawing-room, had been occupied adjusting the candles against a draught. 3 minutes, Slack muttered.
That's all it takes. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly.
3 minutes is quite long enough to ruin a soufflé, to steal a kiss, or to alter a destiny. By noon, the news had spread. Shopkeepers whispered across counters, milkmen lingered on doorsteps, and Miss Hartnell, relishing her new celebrity as witness to the quarrel in the lane, had already described the mysterious woman to half the high street. She was wearing a dark coat. Miss Hartnell insisted to anyone who would listen.
And a hat with a veil, very suspicious.
She might have been Mrs. Lestrange, though of course I wouldn't dream of saying so. Mrs. Lestrange herself. The enigmatic widow who had come to St. Mary Mead only a few months earlier was seen that morning walking toward the post office, elegant, composed, her mourning veil as discreet as her manner. When questioned by Constable Graves, she smiled faintly and said she had been at home all afternoon, unwell, and had received no visitors. Miss Marple watched from her gate as the widow passed.
Unwell, she murmured.
A convenient affliction, often used by guilty consciences and rheumatic joints alike. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Haydock's surgery under the pretext of inquiring about her rheumatism. The doctor, however, was no fool. "You've come to ask about the Colonel," he said, closing the door.
And yes, it's cyanide.
Quick, unmistakable.
Enough in that one lemon slice to fell an ox. Ah, Miss Marple said.
And the question becomes, where does one obtain cyanide in a village such as ours? Haydock frowned. Gardens and trades mostly. Photographic chemicals. Pest control.
Old sheds are full of the stuff.
But it's not easy to handle unnoticed. No, she agreed. Not unless one is already used to handling dangerous things.
Tell me, Doctor, has anyone had cause recently to destroy a dog or rat infestation?
He rubbed his chin. Old Mr. Archer, perhaps. His henhouse was raided. And Dr. Stone, up at Old Hall, has been using cyanide to preserve his archaeological specimens. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Dr. Stone, she repeated. Yes, I recall the archaeologist with the charming secretary. Miss Cram, Haydock said. Efficient young woman.
Knows her business.
Lives up at the Hall, too, for convenience. Convenience, Miss Marple mused. A word that often hides discomfort underneath. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the village slipped once more into whispers, Miss Marple wrote a short note in her tidy hand and delivered it to the vicarage. It read, My dear Mr. Clement, I believe it would be profitable to make a quiet call upon Mrs. Lestrange tomorrow morning. There is a question concerning the lane and the quarrel that must be asked before memory fades or self-control improves. Yours affectionately, Jane Marple. The next day dawned bright. The rain swept clean away. Miss Marple and the vicar called at Mrs. Lestrange's cottage. The lady received them with perfect grace, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. "You wish to speak of Colonel Protheroe," she said.
"Yes, I saw him yesterday.
"He came here at 3:30.
He was angry, terribly angry.
He accused me of concealing something from him."
And then he left. What was the nature of the concealment?"
Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Lestrange hesitated, her gloved hands tightening on the back of a chair. "It was a private matter, Miss Marple."
"But I assure you it has nothing to do with his death." Her voice trembled.
Her poise was exquisite, but brittle. When they left, Miss Marple said quietly to the vicar, "She lies beautifully."
"But not about the quarrel."
"No, she lies to protect someone else. And that is almost always more interesting." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple took out a small notebook she reserved for what she delicately termed human inconsistencies. She wrote, "Colonel Protheroe quarrelled with Mrs. Lestrange, dead by poison. Lemon slice, single portion boursin. Must have been prepared after slicing. Possible access. Gladys, kitchen, Dennis, parcel delivery. Unknown person via back door, 3-minute interval. Cyanide sources, Dr. Stone, Old Hall. Mr. Archer, hen house." She sat back,
tapping the pen.
"Cyanide, she thought, is quick, but it has a smell, a taste, and yet the Colonel drank his tea without complaint. Therefore the poison was masked, disguised, perhaps absorbed in something stronger.
Lemon, yes?"
Bitter covers bitter. But who thought of it? Outside, church bells began their gentle peal for evensong. Miss Marple closed her notebook, rose, and glanced at the clock. "Yes," she murmured. "It will soon be time to call on Old Hall, and to see how neatly Dr. Stone keeps his bottles." Her eyes softened with a faint, knowing smile. People do reveal themselves in their housekeeping. That night, as the moon poured pale light over the damp fields, Inspector Slack paced the vicarage study. "We're narrowing it," he told the vicar grimly. "Poison came from the archaeologist's stock.
I've confirmed it with the manufacturer."
But there's no proof he used it, and his secretary, Miss Cram, swears every bottle is accounted for." Miss Marple, seated by the fire, regarded him calmly. "Then we must assume, Inspector, that someone borrowed a little and returned the rest." He scowled. "You make it sound like sugar for a pudding." "It often is," she replied serenely.
"Except the recipe is rather final." The village slept.
But in her cottage, Miss Marple sat up late by candlelight, her mind tracing the invisible threads that connected lemons, quarrels, and unspoken fears. She wrote a single line beneath her notes. "When death enters by invitation, the host is seldom aware he has opened the door." The candle flame trembled as if in agreement. Chapter. The following morning broke bright and deceptively cheerful, with the kind of sunshine that makes even tragedy appear civilized. The church bells of St. Mary Mead chimed softly across the rooftops, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted from Mrs. Archer's bakery. Yet beneath the village's tranquil rhythm ran an undercurrent of unease, a whisper that followed every footstep. At precisely 9 o'clock, Miss Marple, neat in dove grey, walked up the gravel path to Old Hall, her small parasol tilted against the light. The Hall, a rambling Elizabethan house now leased to Dr. Stone for his archaeological work, sat half-hidden among beeches, its windows glinting like narrowed eyes. A young woman answered the door, Miss Cram, brisk, composed, and as immaculate as a newly inked ledger. Her fair hair was pinned with military precision.
Her hands bore traces of dust and ink. "Dr. Stone is occupied in the workroom, Miss Marple," she said.
"But if it's about the police inquiry, I can answer what I can." "How obliging," Miss Marple said, stepping delicately inside. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, plaster, and, most distinctly, almonds. Miss Cram led her down a corridor lined with glass cases containing fragments of pottery, old coins, and a small, sinister collection of stoppered bottles. The workroom itself was bright and cluttered, every surface occupied by specimens, sketches, and papers. Dr. Stone, a broad, balding man in spectacles, looked up from a microscope with faint irritation. "Good morning," he said. "I understand you were present at the Vicarage tea. Most unfortunate affair. But I can hardly see what brings you here." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "It is merely curiosity, Dr. Stone. I understand that certain of your substances could, if misused, be rather dangerous." "Everything is dangerous when handled foolishly," he said curtly. "But my cyanide is under lock and key. Miss Cram and I are the only ones with access." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured, glancing toward a large wooden cabinet in the corner. A small brass key gleamed in the lock. "You are most careful. Still, care is no safeguard against cleverness, is it? A determined person can often obtain what they wish, even under watchful eyes." Miss Cram's tone sharpened. "Surely you don't suggest—" "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But you know how village tongues wag."
I like to spare people unnecessary suspicion. Suspicion?
Dr. Stone gave a short, dismissive laugh. "I am a man of science, Miss Marple, not melodrama. The police have already inspected my stores and found nothing amiss." "Ah," she said softly. "But people, you see, are often more interesting than stores." She allowed her gaze to drift to Miss Cram, who flushed under its mild scrutiny. There, Miss Marple thought. Something trembles beneath that composure, guilt or fear, or perhaps merely protectiveness. But protectiveness of what or whom? Outside the air was bright and merciless. Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking back at the house. Through the open window drifted the sound of Dr. Stone's raised voice, followed by the sharper tone of Miss Cram's rebuttal. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "so the archaeologist unearths bones above ground as well as below." She continued down the lane, her thoughts quietly ordering themselves. A scientific man, methodical, impatient of interruption. A secretary, efficient, loyal, perhaps too loyal.
Access to poison, yeah?
But motive? The Colonel was a nuisance to many, but not to them.
Unless he discovered something. At the vicarage, Inspector Slack was already deep in discussion with the Reverend Clement.
Miss Marple arrived just in time to hear him say, "We've confirmed the quarrel between the Colonel and Mrs. Lestrange. He accused her of concealing a child, her child apparently, from her late husband, and it seems the boy's been seen about the village lately. She's terrified of scandal." "Then she had reason to fear the Colonel's tongue," the vicar said gravely. Slack nodded. "Exactly.
And she was near the lane at the time.
But she swears she never entered the vicarage. So how would she slip poison into his tea?" "Perhaps she didn't," Miss Marple said quietly. "Perhaps someone else feared that same scandal and feared what the Colonel might reveal." The inspector looked at her keenly. "You mean the boy's father is someone living here?" Miss Marple folded her gloves. "One should never leap to conclusions, Inspector. But one might consider who would have most to lose if Mrs. Lestrange's secret became known." That afternoon, she took tea with Griselda. The younger woman was restless, twisting her napkin into knots. "Jane," she said abruptly, "I know it's wrong to think of such things, but could it be Leonard?"
Could he have done something foolish?
The Colonel was threatening him over those missing funds. Miss Marple looked up gently. "Dear Griselda, your husband's conscience is the steadiest in the parish. Besides, if he wished the Colonel gone, he could simply have prayed for patience." Griselda managed a weak laugh.
I'm sorry. I'm only so tired of the village watching us as if we were actors on a stage. It is a small stage, Miss Marple said kindly, but the audience is very large. She sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful.
"Still, your remark is not entirely without point. The Reverend may not have wished the Colonel dead, but someone wished his silence. And there are many forms of fear besides guilt." The next visitor was young Dennis, the curate, pale and agitated. He had come, he said, to confess something, not to God, but to Miss Marple, whom he clearly regarded as a gentler intermediary. "I went to see Mrs. Lestrange last night," he stammered. "I thought if she quarrelled with the Colonel she might need comfort. But she was very strange, crying, saying things about a sin that could never be forgiven. I thought she meant spiritual, but spiritual sins rarely involve lemon," Miss Marple murmured. "What did she say precisely?" "She said," Dennis whispered, "he would have ruined us both." "Us?" Miss Marple repeated softly. Then there were two. By evening, the entire picture had grown darker, richer, more complex. The Colonel's death, once a simple village tragedy, now seemed a web of secrets. Mrs. Lestrange's hidden child, Dr. Stone's dangerous chemicals, the vicar's uneasy conscience, Miss Cram's nervous loyalty. Miss Marple sat before her fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Everyone gains from his death, she thought. But who gains peace rather than profit? That is where the truth always hides. Her mind lingered on a single image, the fair hair caught upon the lemon spoon. Miss Cram's hair was fair. So was young Dennis's, so perhaps was Mrs. Lestrange's son's. Blood will tell, she thought, even when one tries so very hard to forget it. Later that night, she took a walk through the churchyard, the moon laying a silver path over the stones. She paused by the yew hedge that separated the church from the vicarage garden. On the ground, half buried in mud, something caught her eye, a torn scrap of paper. She bent, picked it up carefully, and by the light of the moon read a few blurred words. "Cannot be allowed to tell him. It would destroy everything." She folded it neatly and slipped it into her handbag. Yes, she thought, we are approaching the heart of it now. The poison was but a tool. The true venom lies in what one wishes to remain untold. As the church clock struck 11, Miss Marple turned homeward, her step slow, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. The case was beginning to breathe, and she could almost hear its pulse beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead. When she reached her cottage, she wrote a single new note beneath her earlier list. Motives deepen Mrs. Lestrange, fear of exposure. Dennis, pity or protection. Dr. Stone, unknown connection. Cyanide source, Miss Cram, loyalty, fear or jealousy. Someone else entirely. The true beneficiary of silence. She placed her pen down and whispered to the empty room. Before dawn breaks twice more, I shall know. The candle flickered once, and she smiled faintly. Chapter 4. The following day dawned with the kind of pale, deceptive calm that Miss Marple had learned to distrust. Clouds like thin muslin drifted above St. Mary Mead, and the hedgerows glittered with dew. It was a day, she thought, when secrets might begin to come undone. At 8:30, a knock sounded at her door. Standing there, dishevelled and rain-splashed despite the clear sky, was Inspector Slack. He removed his hat, more out of habit than deference. "Morning, Miss Marple. You're an early riser, I see." "One must be," she replied, "if one wishes to see what happens before people are awake enough to conceal it." Slack grunted. "We've a new wrinkle. The post-mortem confirms cyanide, yes, but taken in liquid form. And we found a residue of glycerin mixed with the acid in the lemon slice. Not amateur work. Someone knew precisely how to mask the taste." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, so we seek not a passionate fool, but a careful mind." "Careful, yes," Slack said, pulling a paper from his pocket. "And we've also received this from the late Colonel's desk. Seems he'd written a note the very morning of his death, meant for the police. It says, 'If anything happens to me, look to the vicarage.'"
"I have proof of deceit within its walls." Miss Marple's teacup paused mid-air. "How extraordinary," she said mildly. "Proof of deceit, you say?"
"And yet deceit takes so many shapes."
"Can be arithmetic."
or affection slack-eyed her.
You think it's a bluff? I think, she said, setting down her cup, that the dead are often used by the living to say what they never said at all. The vicarage that morning was alive with quiet panic.
Griselda, pale and tremulous, was attempting to pack a basket for the orphanage while Leonard Clement stood at the window. "Jaw tight! They're saying," Griselda whispered, "that the Colonel meant you, Leonard, that he had proof you'd misused parish funds." "I have nothing to hide," the vicar said, "but one cannot reason with gossip. I must bear it as I would a storm." Miss Marple entered, with her usual calm. "Storms pass, my dear Reverend, but they do tend to leave debris behind. Tell me, did the Colonel ever actually accuse you of wrongdoing?"
Not directly, he admitted.
"But he hinted. He said the accounts would expose something."
I thought he meant my errors in arithmetic. Errors, Miss Marple repeated softly.
Or perhaps something that only looked like error. "I wonder, might I see your account book?" Griselda fetched it, a large leather-bound ledger. Miss Marple flipped through the pages with quick, bird-like eyes.
"Ah, yes," she said.
"Here we are. The payment to Mr. Archer for repairs entered twice, but one sum smaller. You refunded the difference, I suppose?" "Of course," Leonard said, frowning. "I noted it on the following page." "Indeed you did," she said. "But to a casual observer, say, an irritable colonel, it would look as though something were missing." "So you think he mistook it?" "Men often do," Miss Marple replied gently, "particularly men accustomed to finding fault." That afternoon, she took her customary walk through the village. The gossip had ripened to scandal.
Heads turned wherever she went.
Outside the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was in full sermon. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, the vicar's 2 miles by half."
Evil always creeps in through meekness. How fortunate, then, Miss Marple said sweetly,
"that you shall never be troubled by it." She left the woman gaping and continued down the lane toward Mrs. Lestrange's cottage. The widow received her without surprise. "I thought you might come," she said softly. "You have kind eyes, Miss Marple, but they see too much." "I see only what people forget to hide," Miss Marple replied.
"You said the Colonel came to you angry."
"Did he mention his note?" Mrs. Lestrange hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He said he would see to the vicarage before the day was done."
"He wanted me to sign a statement, but I refused." "What sort of statement?"
The woman's hands clenched in her lap. "He claimed my son was born before my marriage, that I had deceived my husband, and that the child's true father lived in this village. He threatened to ruin us both." "Your son," Miss Marple said softly. "Would his name by any chance be Dennis?" Mrs. Lestrange's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You've guessed it, yes, he is my child. I gave him to a relative when he was small, so that he might have a respectable life. The Colonel discovered the truth."
"I thought if I told him, he would show mercy. Instead, he laughed." Miss Marple touched her hand.
"You poor soul."
"And the young man knows nothing?"
"Nothing. He believes himself an orphan."
"And now, oh dear God, if they discover—" "Do not distress yourself," Miss Marple said, rising.
"The truth, like light, can be merciful or cruel, depending on who holds the lamp." As she left, she met young Dennis walking up the lane, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. He greeted her awkwardly, unaware that he had just passed his own mother. Miss Marple sighed. "Secrets," she murmured, "are poor guardians of the innocent." That evening, the inspector called again at the vicarage. "We found traces of cyanide on the lemon plate, yes, but also on the sugar tongs." "Which makes no sense, since the Colonel didn't take sugar." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Unless someone handled both, unthinkingly, or deliberately." "Might I see the tongs?" Slack passed them over. She examined them through her spectacles. "Ah," she said, "there is a small nick here. Someone forced it open with a knife, clumsy fingers." She looked up. "Inspector, was anyone in the habit of polishing the silver before tea?" "Gladys," Griselda said. "I asked her to do it yesterday morning." "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "silver polish contains traces of ammonia. and when combined with certain acids it creates the same faint bitter scent as cyanide. If our culprit meant to clean the evidence, he or she might well have created the smell we now mistake for poison residue. Slack frowned. So the tongs might not have touched the poison at all. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Which means our poison came not from careless hands, but deliberate ones. Later that night, she sat by her candlelight, reviewing her notes. Something new had begun to take shape, a pattern, subtle and cruel. The lemon slice, the fair hair, the quarrel, the hidden sun. The Colonel threatened exposure. Mrs. Lestrange feared disgrace. Dennis feared losing his vocation. Dr. Stone feared scandal. But who among them feared discovery the most? Her gaze drifted to a small silver frame on her mantel, an old photograph of her late nephew Raymond as a boy standing beside the vicar, bright-eyed and solemn. It reminded her how easily innocence could be used by those who ought to protect it. Yes, she thought, the truth is near, and when it comes, it will destroy not one life, but two. At midnight, there was a knock at her door. Gladys stood there shaking. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't mean to. Please, I didn't mean to do wrong." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently.
"Sit by the fire and tell me everything," Gladys sobbed.
It was Miss Cram. She came to the kitchen just before tea, said Dr. Stone had sent her to borrow the lemon plate to measure something for the exhibit, then brought it back a minute later.
"I thought nothing of it. Oh, please don't tell. She'll lose her place."
Miss Marple laid a calming hand upon her arm. "You've done quite right to speak. The truth may frighten us, but it never betrays us. Go home and say nothing more tonight." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple extinguished her lamp and sat for a long while in darkness, her mind arranging the puzzle into order. Miss Cram borrowed the plate. Dr. Stone supplied the means, but for whose sake? Then, slowly her lips parted in the faintest sigh. "Ah, for love's sake, of course." At dawn, she wrote a note to Inspector Slack. "Inspector, the time for caution is past. I ask that you call a meeting at the Vicarage this afternoon, 4 o'clock. Invite Dr. Stone, Miss Cram, Mrs. Lestrange, Mr. Dennis, and the Clements. The truth will not hide any longer once the candlelight falls." Jane Marple, she sealed the envelope, and as she watched the postboy cycle away down the lane, she whispered, "By this evening, St. Mary Mead shall have its revelation and its reckoning." Chapter Fee. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the vicarage drawing-room had resumed its dreadful role as the theatre of death, and now of revelation. The rain had returned, a light, ceaseless drizzle that pressed grey fingers against the window-panes. The air inside carried the faint tang of polish and anxiety. Candles burned on the mantel, their steady light reflecting in polished silver and watchful eyes. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, was the picture of gentle composure. Yet behind that mild exterior lay the meticulous mind of a hunter. Every detail was arranged, every guest summoned precisely, every chair set as deliberately as pieces upon a chessboard. Reverend Clement stood by the fireplace, outwardly calm, but his hands betrayed him, tapping the edge of his sermon notes as though they might steady his heart. Griselda, pale but radiant in her resolve, sat close to him. Inspector Slack leaned against the doorframe, notebook in hand, his bulldog patience balanced on the edge of curiosity. Dr. Stone arrived first, his expression stiff, defensive. Miss Cram followed, composed, efficient, but with a tightness around her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights. Mrs. Lestrange came last, gloved and veiled, her composure exquisite yet fragile, like glass before a storm. Dennis the curate slipped in quietly, pale and trembling. Miss Marple greeted each of them with her usual warmth.
"My dears," she said softly, "we are here not for accusation, but for understanding."
And sometimes, when one understands, confession follows naturally, like evening after sunset. The silence that followed was nearly reverent. Then Miss Marple began. "I have thought a great deal," she said, "about the circumstances of Colonel Protheroe's death. It was not a crime of opportunity, but of calculation. The poison was not in the pot, nor the sugar, nor the milk, but in a single slice of lemon, carefully prepared and replaced. Whoever did so knew the Colonel's habits, his preference for lemon, his manner of helping himself. That narrows our field to those who knew him intimately enough to predict his behaviour." Her eyes flickered toward the vicar and Griselda, then to Dr. Stone. "It also required access to cyanide, and knowledge of how to disguise its taste." Dr. Stone shifted in his chair. "You're suggesting that I—" "Not directly, Doctor," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But I believe your laboratory was the source of the poison. Whether you supplied it knowingly or not is quite another matter." Miss Cram rose sharply.
"That's absurd. Dr. Stone keeps everything locked."
"Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And yet, when I visited yesterday, the key was still in the cabinet." Miss Cram flushed crimson.
I must have forgotten to remove it." "Quite," Miss Marple said mildly.
"One forgets such things only when one is in a hurry, or when one means to be found careless later." "It was very clever of you, Miss Cram, to make it appear so." The young woman's composure cracked.
"You think I killed him?"
"I think you loved a man who feared exposure," Miss Marple replied softly. "And love, my dear, is often far more dangerous than hate." Dr. Stone's chair scraped against the floor. "Miss Marple, this is intolerable." "Please, Doctor," Miss Marple said quietly, "let us not perform indignation. It never fits well on the guilty or the innocent."
"Allow me to finish," she turned to Mrs. Lestrange. "You, madam, have suffered enough from secrets."
"The Colonel knew your past, knew that your son, the curate, was born before your marriage. He threatened to make it known, thereby destroying both your peace and your son's vocation. You begged him to be silent. He refused. You were desperate, but not murderous.
Instead, someone else took pity on you." Mrs. Lestrange's gloved hands trembled.
"Who?" Miss Cram, Miss Marple said softly. "She overheard part of your quarrel. She guessed the truth. And she also knew that the Colonel meant to blackmail Dr. Stone, who, it seems, had once lent you financial help when your husband's debts drove you nearly to ruin."
"To protect him, and you she acted." Miss Cram sprang to her feet. "No, I only wanted to frighten him. I meant him to be ill, not dead. I thought—" A small dose. The room froze.
Slack's pencil hung motionless. Miss Marple's voice was tender but relentless. "You took the cyanide from the cabinet, dissolved a trace into the lemon slice, and replaced the plate while Griselda was upstairs. You knew the Colonel's vanity, his habit of serving himself first. You meant to warn him, not to kill him. But cyanide has no half measures." Dr. Stone turned toward her, horror dawning.
"My God, Alice!"
She sank into her chair, weeping softly.
"He was going to destroy you," she whispered.
"He said he'd exposed that you'd helped Mrs. Lestrange, that you'd lied about the grant money, that you'd lose your post."
"I couldn't let him. I couldn't." Mrs. Lestrange rose, voice trembling with pity. "Oh, my dear child, what have you done?" "I did it for love," Miss Cram sobbed.
"I thought I could bear the sin if it spared him." Dr. Stone bowed his head, his face ashen. "Then the guilt is mine," he said quietly. "I allowed her devotion to blind her. I should have spoken, told the truth, faced ruin if necessary."
Instead, Miss Marple said gently, "a man lies in his grave, and 3 souls are burdened with what cannot be undone." Inspector Slack cleared his throat.
"Well, that's confession enough for any magistrate." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "Not quite, Inspector. There is still one matter unresolved, the Colonel's letter. It was, you see, not written by him at all." Slack stared.
"Not written?"
"No, a forgery produced after his death intended to throw suspicion upon the vicarage. The handwriting was clever, but not clever enough. Whoever wrote it knew the Colonel's style, yet misspelled the word vicarage, a word the Colonel had written correctly in parish reports for years." Griselda gasped softly. "Then who forged it?" "Miss Cram," Miss Marple said, turning once more to the trembling secretary. "You meant to protect Dr. Stone even after the deed was done. You thought to mislead the police, to divert suspicion elsewhere. That, I fear, was your second mistake." The young woman hid her face in her hands. "I would have confessed sooner," she sobbed, "but I was afraid. He would have taken the blame." "Love is often a cruel redeemer," Miss Marple murmured. "You wished to save him, and instead you damned yourself." Inspector Slack moved to the door, summoning his constable. "Alice Cram," he said gravely, "I must take you into custody for the unlawful killing of Colonel Lucius Protheroe." She rose unsteadily, and Dr. Stone caught her hand.
"Alice, I will do everything I can." She looked at him with tearful eyes. "I don't regret it," she said. "Only that I failed." Miss Marple stood.
"You succeeded, my dear, too well. That is the tragedy." As they left, silence settled upon the room once more. Only the clock on the mantel continued its patient ticking, as though measuring the breath of the living and the silence of the dead. When the door had closed, Griselda sat down heavily.
"Jane," she whispered, "how could you bear it, all that knowing?"
Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, one does not bear it. One observes it, tidies it away, and makes tea." The vicar looked at her with quiet awe. "You have a strange gift, Miss Marple." She shook her head.
"No gift, Mr. Clement, merely observation."
Life, after all, repeats itself endlessly in small villages. Motives change their names, but not their shapes.
Love, jealousy, fear, always the same ingredients.
Just a different recipe. Outside, the drizzle ceased, and a faint light broke through the clouds, falling upon the window pane like the ghost of forgiveness. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt.
"I shall take my leave now," she said softly.
There is nothing more dreadful to witness than repentance. It deserves privacy. And as she stepped into the cool evening air, the faint scent of lemon still lingered in the rain-washed garden. Chapter 6. The drawing-room of the vicarage, for the third time in as many days, was filled with the tremor of quiet voices and the smell of damp wool. The rain had ceased entirely. A pale, watery sun had pushed its way through the clouds and gilded the wet fields beyond the window. Yet inside, the atmosphere remained suspended. The fragile stillness that follows confession, and the heavy silence before justice. Inspector Slack sat by the writing table, completing his report with short, emphatic strokes of the pen. The vicar moved about the room distractedly, gathering cups, straightening cushions, performing small mercies for the sake of composure. Griselda stood by the window, her reflection pale in the glass. Miss Marple, seated near the fire, held her hands folded neatly in her lap, as serene as a cat in a patch of sun, but beneath that serenity, her mind was turning still. Not from suspicion now, but from compassion. The confession had explained the how, but not the why. The full truth, she knew, still lingered. Fragile, unspoken, waiting to be drawn forth. Inspector Slack broke the silence. "She's signed the statement," he said flatly. "Alice Cram admits she placed the poisoned lemon slice, believing a small dose would frighten the colonel. She blames herself alone, believing it would frighten him," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Yes, that is always the way with half measures of evil. They think to warn, to wound, or never to kill. And yet death slips through such small openings." "She'll stand trial," Slack said. "The court may show mercy. She's young, she's penitent." "Mercy," Miss Marple murmured, "belongs to God. The law deals only in consequences." The vicar turned, troubled.
"And Dr. Stone?"
"He'll face an inquiry," Slack replied. "The cyanide was under his care. But the law can't punish heartbreak, Reverend."
"Nor can it mend it." He closed his notebook with a snap.
"A neat enough ending, Miss Marple, though I confess I don't understand how you saw it all so quickly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, Inspector, I have watched gardens all my life. When one flower withers unnaturally, one does not blame the sun. One looks for the rootworm beneath." When they had gone, the vicar poured Miss Marple another cup of tea. "No lemon?" he asked, with a half-smile. "Not for a little while, thank you," she said. "I've had enough of citrus intrigue." They both smiled softly, though the humour sat fragilely in the air. After a moment, Griselda spoke. "Jane," she said hesitantly, "you said yesterday that love was more dangerous than hate. Do you truly believe that?" Miss Marple looked into her cup, as though the faint swirl of tea leaves might answer for her. "Yes, my dear."
"'Cause love is clever.
It justifies what conscience would condemn. It wears so many disguises, into protection, sacrifice, even virtue. And yet, the vicar murmured, without love, what would remain of humanity? Justice, perhaps, Miss Marple said. But justice without mercy is a sword without a hilt. You may strike, but you cannot hold it. That evening, the parish gathered in subdued whispers outside the churchyard gates. The colonel's body had been laid to rest under a heavy yew, the rain-darkened headstone already gathering moss. Few mourned him deeply. Yet, in his passing, the village had learned a sharp lesson, that wickedness seldom travels alone, and righteousness is rarely simple. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a scandal that should teach the young to guard their tea-trays, Miss Hartnell claimed. She had known something dreadful would happen the moment. Miss Cram took lodgings at the hall. Mrs. Archer merely shook her head and muttered, "Well, love's love, and it do make fools of the best." Miss Marple listened with her mild, approving smile and said nothing. When she returned home that night, the cottage seemed unusually still. She lit her candle, placed it on the mantel, and sat by the window, looking out toward the vicarage, where a single light burned in the study. The sound of distant bells drifted faintly through the damp air. So many tragedies begin with kindness, she thought. A good intention left too long unspoken, a tender heart shielding another from truth. In villages, as in souls, secrets grow best in gentle soil. She rose, went to her desk, and opened her small notebook, her private ledger of human frailty. She wrote in her neat hand, "Case of the Vicarage tea victim, Colonel Lucius Protheroe, overbearing, prideful, destructive, culprit Miss Alice Cram, devoted, impulsive, misguided, cause poisoned lemon slice, cyanide, prepared in fear and love, motive, protection of Dr. Stone and Mrs. Lestrange from disgrace. Lesson, love, when blinded by fear, sees only mercy where guilt begins." She closed the notebook and sighed. The candle guttered low, its light trembling across the worn lace curtain. "Ah," she whispered, "if only the young would trust truth more than tenderness. But they never do, and so we old women must watch and tidy and bury the broken pieces." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of roses from the churchyard. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She thought of Dennis, who would soon learn who his mother truly was, of Mrs. Lestrange, who would live on with her secret half revealed, of Miss Cram, whose act of devotion had led her from loyalty to destruction, and of Dr. Stone, who would spend his remaining years weighed beneath the gentlest of prisons, remorse. The clock struck 10. Miss Marple rose and blew out the candle, leaving the room in tender darkness. Her voice, when she spoke, was no louder than the hush of the wind outside. It is always the same. Love, pride, fear, and pity. They brew together like tea left too long to steep. And when the taste turns bitter, no one quite remembers who poured it first. She turned from the window, her figure framed briefly by the last glimmer of the dying flame. Miss Marple's reflection, the sun had returned at last to St. Mary Mead, warm and golden, as though attempting to mend what the storm had broken. The lilacs in Miss Marple's garden were heavy with bloom, their scent rich in the air, and bees droned lazily among them, untroubled by human folly. In her parlour, Miss Marple sat at her small escritoire, her spectacles perched low upon her nose, writing slowly in violet ink. The village, seen through her window, seemed almost serene again, washing fluttering on lines, children's laughter echoing near the green, the faint toll of the church bell marking the hour with its habitual gentleness. But beneath the tranquillity lay the residue of unease that always follows the exposure of darkness. Her pen moved softly over the paper. It is the peculiar nature of truth, she wrote, that it is seldom simple and almost never pure. Those who act in its defence are as often condemned as those who betray it. For the heart is not a scale of justice, but a mirror. It shows whatever stands before it, and cannot distinguish beauty from deception unless light falls upon it just so. She paused, sipped her tea, without lemon, and smiled faintly at the irony. How extraordinary, she thought, that death should enter so gently, on the clink of a teaspoon. Her mind drifted to Miss Cram, the quiet young woman who had meant only to frighten, not to kill, to Mrs. Lestrange, whose long-kept secret had at last been forced into the open light, to poor Dr. Stone, who would live with both gratitude and guilt as companions. So much of evil begins with love misdirected, she mused. I have seen it before, and shall again. For the world does not change, only the faces do. She set her pen aside and gazed at the small fire that burned in the grate, despite the mildness of the day. It flickered softly, as though aware of its duty to memory, to warm, but not to consume. How strange, she thought, that those who live among roses and sermons and tea services should still harbour passions capable of murder. Yet she knew that beneath lace and prayer books, beneath civility and custom, human nature remained what it had always been, fragile, foolish, and infinitely cunning when driven by fear or tenderness. A knock came at the door. It was the vicar, hat in hand, his kindly face touched by lingering sorrow. I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, he said, for seeing clearly when the rest of us could not. It feels strange, though, to know that so much pain was born here, in this peaceful little village. Miss Marple smiled. Pain, Mr. Clement, is the most democratic visitor we have.
It knocks at every gate eventually.
But we mustn't think the village less good for it. Only more human, he nodded. You're right, as always. Griselda sends her love, and says she'll never slice a lemon again without trembling. Tell her, Miss Marple said with a twinkle. That fear is a very good teacher, so long as it doesn't spoil the tea. They both laughed softly. When the vicar had gone, she sat a moment longer, gazing out at the garden. The sun glowed upon the wet leaves. The world looked innocent again. But innocence, she knew, was a mask, delicate, easily cracked, always worn a little askew. She reached for her notebook once more, adding a final entry beneath the case notes. The world may judge by verdict, but the heart judges by silence, and in silence the truth always returns, not to condemn, but to remind. As dusk fell, she rose to light a single candle upon the mantel. The flame shimmered, steady and graceful, throwing a long shadow across the room. She watched it for a time, her expression soft, her eyes reflecting its golden tremor. Outside, the evening breeze whispered through the lilacs, carrying with it the mingled scent of earth, smoke,
and forgiveness. And as the candle burned low, Miss Marple whispered,
another secret met its shadow. Candlelight Mysteries channel message. If you enjoyed this story, dear listener, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth, and every shadow conceals a secret. Here, by the trembling light of a single flame, we breathe life once more into the grand tradition of the Golden Age, of quiet villages, dark intentions, and detectives who see more than they ever say. Pause. The candle flickers. A distant clock strikes midnight. Another secret fades. By candlelight,